Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's video, we're going to be ranking every Pokemon of the Dark typing. If you enjoy this and you want to see more, like and subscribe for more content. And comment question of the day, what's your favorite Dark type to use in competitive? This generation, it's honestly got to be Dark on Kingambit for me. Kingambit's easily one of the best Dark types in the format in my opinion as far as VGC goes, and I think it's a really splashable option as well. With that said, let me know what your answers are down below, and let's get into the list. So, we're going to start off, of course, by, just like we did last time, putting Arceus in the S tier. When we look at S tiers, these should be Pokemon that, while they don't need to be Arceus level good, they need to at least be as influential in terms of their format. One of the things that Arceus does, essentially, as far as the singles Ubers game, because we're probably not going to see Arceus legal in a double setting, is Arceus essentially does, in any format it's allowed, and mandate some basic threshold of speed tier, threshold for just general bulk, and really just a well-rounded move pool. And these essentially need to be what the other S tiers do need to hit for VGC standards. They need to be well-rounded. They need to be Pokemon that can absolutely focus the metagame around them while still being fairly impactful to it as well. And that needs to be like what the S tier defines. The A tier is going to be for Pokemon that still play an important role. These would be Pokemon like, for example, Sandy Shocks, where it's a decent Pokemon for sure in the tier, but you're not seeing the metagame revolve around Sandy Shocks. It just has a place with like the Espathros, Sandy Shocks cores, for example. The B tier is going to be for Pokemon that you'll see every now and then. These would be Pokemon, like if we go further down, for example, you'd probably see, like, for example, the rare Lycanroc, or like the Taurus Blaze, or the Iron Valiant, where these are Pokemon you wouldn't be surprised to run into them, but you would still not exactly be preparing for these specifically in any given game, unless your team was, like, 6-0'd by them. The C tiers are going to be for very niche stuff that really only revolves around specific S tiers and A tiers becoming really highly used in the format, or really most of the A tiers, to be honest, because the S tiers should just be expected in every game. But the A tiers really, if one of those was to be surging in usage, you might see something in the C tier become actually used. The D tiers are going to be for Pokemon that are really just YouTuber picks, and the F tiers are going to be for Pokemon that you just flat out should not use. So with that said, we obviously have the Arceus Dark up here, really one of the best Arceus forms in the game. The Dark typing is amazing. This is sadly probably also the Arceus type that gets hurt the most this generation among actual cut moves. For example, if we go into the Scarlet and Violet cut stuff, for example, and we go into the Arceus, I do actually need to go into the, here we go, removed moves. Oh, never mind. I need to pull up Arceus' stuff specifically because Arceus was actually fairly cut by this. Let's see. Okay, so I can't actually find where this thing is, but overall, I mean, Arceus did lose some stuff. If I remember correctly, it did lose Perish Trap on a Perish Song. It was either Perish Song or Whirlpool, I forget which. I'm pretty sure it was Whirlpool. So it can't actually pull off the Perish Trap sets, which is very unfortunate, because for Dark Arceus, that was actually a pretty cool tech on it. So overall, definitely a pretty big, yeah, it looks like it was Whirlpool that was cut, because it does keep Perish Song. So fairly unfortunate for Arceus, because that was actually a pretty cool gimmick that Dark did actually pull off pretty well. Otherwise, though, still a pretty good Amon in general. Still one of the better Arceus forms in general. And let's get into the actual Pokemon that do kind of have any sort of weight behind their tiering. Starting with Galar Moltres. Now, if this was Generation 8 with Dynamax around, I think Galar Moltres would actually have a spot in the S tier. This was an incredible pick during all of Generation 8 since its introduction, with this thing being essentially the flagship Dark type that was not Incineroar or in Series like 13 of Yveltal. This Pokemon was a great Dynamax candidate with Max Airstream and Max Darkness being good for it. It was an amazing partner with Comfey for weakness policy variants as well, in tandem with Berserk. Sadly, it doesn't really have the benefit of Airstream anymore, activating as a good speed boosting option, nor does it really have the Dynamax to justify weakness policy sets a bit easier. Now, agility is still pretty good on this, and you could still definitely take advantage of Terra, but ultimately, I'm going to slot this in the A tier. I think it's still a really strong Pokemon, and when it is introduced, this is going to be something that teams will still need to prepare for, but I wouldn't exactly say the meta is going to define itself around this. Even if we also happen to get Comfey back, I still think it's going to be a bit before we really see a Galar Moltres meta again. Alolan Persian is going to be the B tier. I think that the support that Alolan Persian provides will still be valuable, actually, when Series whatever comes around where Persian is a usable Pokemon. It really just depends on when home stuff is introduced, of course, similarly to Galar Moltres. This thing keeping stuff like Fake Out, for example, is really good. Sadly, I'm pretty sure this also keeps Icy Wind. Yep. So you still get Icy Wind, and you still have options like Technician and Fur Coat's abilities. I do think this mon suffers a little bit from open team sheet being a thing, as the bluff between Furgo and Technician was a pretty easy one to pull off, as you could typically utilize either set with pretty similar movesets. So I think Persian's definitely a mon that gets a little bit screwed over by open sheet, and will definitely see a little bit less play due to that. However, it benefits a lot more from Dynamax not existing, so I think that Persian's probably it's about even, to be honest. But Persian overall, definitely sitting in the B tier for sure. The fast support will be great though, but honestly, the meta got so fast with the paradoxes alone, let alone the Ruin Pokemon introducing stuff like Chien-Pao or just home mons coming back, that Alolan Persian's not exactly sitting in the best place compared to where it was in like a Generation 7 or Generation 8 was still kind of bad, but Generation 7 at least, it's definitely not going to be sitting up there. But it won't be as bad as it was in the Dynamax meta. Alolan Muck is up next. This is definitely another B tier. Super Berries being nerfed definitely sucks. Losing Pursuit definitely sucks. If it had at least one of those things, we'd see it in the A tier. And if it had both, you might even see it in the argument for S. Terra is pretty cool on this. However, on the downside, I think that Terra hurts this a lot more than it benefits, because the Poison Dark typing is actually fairly useful, and Ground is a fairly common Terra type. So I think that definitely hurts, especially when Steel is also a fairly common Terra type, and both of those would kind of screw over Muck to a degree. Alolan Muck is still a decent AV sponge, and this would actually be fairly useful for a lot of special threats. You could probably even utilize this as a check to Pokemon like Fluttermane, which could actually play into your favor a bit. Overall, Alolan Muck, I think, will actually get some usage. I think it'll have some top cuts as well, but I don't think it's going to be nearly as good as it was in Generation 7. Definitely a B tier for sure. Umbreon is also a B tier. Really good support option, great Snarl user, synchronizes pretty cool ability. But sadly, I feel like Umbreon just doesn't, it's kind of hard to really justify. You need a very specific team for Umbreon to work, but it does get some cool options, like for example Snarl. You get stuff like Helping Hand as well in your arsenal, which both of those are actually pretty good options. Reliable recovery of Moonlight, stuff like Yawn as well as support. Like, you could definitely make some stuff work on this mod. I just think that Umbreon can definitely get taken advantage of a bit too easily with stuff like the Paradox forms in this metagame, to where it's a little bit harder to justify it, but it's always a mon that does find a way to be viable. Ever since I've started watching VGC, I've always found this thing for some reason at some high-ranking tournament. Like, I remember this thing doing well in 2016 Worlds, for example. It did well in 2019 Worlds, for example. It did well at 22. Just as a whole, it did well in 22, to be completely honest, Worlds and otherwise. But Umbreon definitely, though, this isn't exactly the metagame for Umbreon currently, but I think that as we get higher power creep, Umbreon will find a way to be viable, especially as a potential check to maybe random home mons, like Galar Moltres, for example. You can maybe Snarl through that. Overall, though, definitely going to be a B tier for sure. Murkrow gets an A tier. Murkrow would have been an S tier if we were only doing like a Series 1 tier list. However, without the cutting of mons like Chien-Pao, Roaring Moon, or really any other home Pokemon, or just banned Pokemon from Series 1, honestly, Murkrow just has a bit of a power creep issue to where it's still fine. You can still definitely make Murkrow work, as it has a wide enough support move pool. It's Roll Compression with Haze and Tailwind. It's honestly fucking incredible. The fact that you can actually put so much pressure onto Nozo teams while still also providing a strong HO option for your partners is really nothing to be overestimated, or underestimated, I should say. But Murkrow still definitely is just a bit too passive. Even if we compare Pokemon like Whimsicott, for example, they did actually provide a somewhat viable offensive niche to the metagame, and Grim obviously does with stuff like Spirit Break being not only a good fairy option, which is extremely spammable, but also able to drop special attack. Foul Play essentially essentially banks off the opponent being a good physical attacker, and versus any special attacker, you do negligible damage. It still has enough good support options, and it's essentially like the ultimate support Pokemon in my opinion, between stuff like Quash, Feather Dance, Haze, Tailwind, Thunderwave, Sunny Day, Rain Dance. Like, you can make a lot work on Murkrow, but I think that it's still just a bit too underwhelming. We're gonna give it the A tier for sure. I will say as well, we're gonna start to order these Pokemon. Just because while I didn't do it on the normal tier list, on the general mon tier list, I think it's important to obviously put these in order among their tiering. Murkrow will definitely be at the front of the A tier, and I think this should hopefully help at least draw a clearish line depending on how clunky these tiers get for what ends up actually being the best Pokemon among its tier, what was a borderline pick, etc. Assuming Qwilfish gets a C tier, this is a strong option, and it's similar to Murkrow where it gets the Violet, it gets options like Haze, for example, as well as some other good support like T-Spikes, which is actually proven to be fairly useful in a Dondozo heavy metagame. So Hisuian Qwilfish actually does have a lot of merit there. With only one weakness to ground, that's also a fairly good option, as you could potentially Tera around certain things that would be going for a ground typing with a Tera Flying, for example, or even just go for like a Tera Normal, Tera Ghost, really whatever you want to go with. You can make probably work as a defensive typing on Quill. You get some other good options too, like for example Taunt. You can just go for Raw Toxic on this, Destiny Bond. You really do have a lot that can actually work on this thing. And with the Poison Point ability as well, it's actually fairly useful just defensively speaking, because any physical attacker, which there are a lot of in this format, would have, well, anything that's going to attack with contact, I should say, would have the ability to potentially activate Poison Point, which is cool. You also have Intimidate, which is probably your more useful ability. However, with a lot of Clear Mint running around, I do think Poison Point at least has a somewhat useful niche in this metagame, depending on what ends up being viable or not. So I think that could be useful. Just an open sheet, it's kind of useless. Really, this would more so be like a ladder tech, if anything. On top of that as well, Qwilfish does have a pretty decent benefit at the very least of being immune to Prankster Taunt, which is something that a lot of this list has. Obviously, that's not going to be unique for any of these Pokemon, but in such a support-heavy Pokemon that doesn't have Prankster of its own, that's actually kind of a useful thing for it. So we're going to give Hisuian Qwilfish the C tier. Sneasel gets the D tier. This solely gets D tier because it's a good partner for Cole, and it's still probably one of the better partners for Cole because it's the weakest fast surf option that you can get. While Weavile has a slightly better option in comparison to Sneasel as just a general metagame Pokemon, and Dragapult has just been the partner for Cole in generalist format, Sneasel still having Fake Out plus Surf is actually a cool tandem for it, so we'll give it the D tier. Houndoom is F tier, honestly pretty terrible Pokemon. Houndoom having the fire immunity is really the best I could say. You can maybe, I guess, if you really want to make Houndoom work, make like a Tera Grass set and just essentially pull off a really shitty version of Armarouge. However, at the same time, this thing doesn't really have the coverage pool to make it work. Fire, Dark, and Grass, though, with specifically like a Tera Blast Grass, would actually be fairly decent. But the 95 speed isn't really cutting it in this format, especially when you're also not exactly bulky either. And I think, really, that's all I have to say about Houndoom. Definitely F tier. If it was Mega Houndoom though, this would be like a C or B tier, to be honest. Tyranitar gets a solid A tier. Definitely bottom of A. Actually, Tyranitar actually probably gets the top of A tier in this format, I can't lie. Terrastle's been really kind to this Pokemon. On top of that as well, we've seen a lot of Terrestrial types that weirdly enough have been adopting past just the flying type that everyone would be typically running. I've seen Psychic on a team actually fairly recently. It's specifically meant to check stuff like Amoonguss and take advantage of Psychic Terrain, which is pretty cool. Obviously you have Dark and Rock that are both fairly viable. You can really make a lot of options work in Tyranitar, and it's taken a lot more of an offensive role back in the metagame, with stuff like, for example, Choice Band Tyranitar being pretty good on Trick Room, but you also have Assault Vest Tyranitar being a great defensive sponge. You have Weakness Policy being great to activate itself and then just sweep through teams with like a Dragon Dance set or on Tailwind builds. So really Tyranitar I think just hasn't really had a format where it's been this good in a while. This is probably the best Tyranitar has been in my time playing VGC, because it definitely was not this potent in series, in series 17 through 19. Well, VGC 17 through 19, it definitely was not this potent in Generation 8. In fact, Generation 8 was probably the worst format for Tyranitar. Well, no, maybe 7 was. But definitely 7 or 8. 6 was a fine format for it, but this is probably the best format that it's had in my time playing VGC. I didn't play in 5 or 4. But realistically, I still think Tyranitar is definitely at the top of its game. Very borderline S tier as well, in my opinion, but I think the S tiers have a little bit better of a niche to where, more so a little bit better of a chokehold. And Tyranitar, I think, is still having a bit of an identity issue in this format, just considering how much other viable weathers there are. And on top of it as well, I think that Tyranitar is having a little bit of a tough time fitting onto a lot of team comps, but it still is fairly good. I mean, it's just under 6% usage right now. AV sets are pretty solid. We're seeing that a lot more recently, but it still is overall a pretty good Pokemon for sure. Definite A tier in my opinion. Sableye gets a C tier. This is definitely better than Qwilfish though, but Sableye has a lot of good uses in this format. Between stuff like Prankster, Quash, you have stuff like Disable on your set as well, dual screens. This is essentially just like a budget Grim, but it also has Quash, which is pretty cool. You have statuses with Will-O-Wisp and Thunderwave both being in your arsenal. You can go for trick sets. Obviously, you have Fake Out. I think I forgot to say that. Knockoff. Really, this is just like the bastard child of Murkrow and Grimmsnarl in a good way, to be honest. I think this mod is actually pretty decent. And it has some very specific comps where I think Sableye is actually the better choice than Murkrow or Grimm. But it's really only teams that benefit from having both Quash and also the screens, and that's really about it. Still an okay support option, but definitely a little underwhelming right now. C tier. Cacturne's an F tier. probably going to be one of the worst options in the F tier, to be honest, that we have today. I love Cacturne, and I think it's a fun mon. It's also a fucking terrible Pokemon. Realistically, Sandfell doesn't really cut it. Water Absorb doesn't really cut it. The offenses are fine, but 55 speed is pretty terrible for both Trick Room and Tailwind. Definite F tier. Honchkrow gets D tier purely because of Moxie and the fact that you could actually probably utilize Terra on this Pokemon to be semi-usable in like a really niche sense. At the same time though, I mean, really the 71 speed just barely brings this thing into a useful range on Tailwind. Meanwhile, the 125 attack is also pretty good, especially with Moxie. You could also maybe make Super Luck sets work, but overall, definitely a fairly shit Pokemon. Definitely the worst thing in D tier. It's probably going to end up being the worst. Skuntank, right above it in D tier. Realistically, the fact that this thing gets Haze is pretty cool. If this thing got Toxic Spikes, you could actually maybe see Skuntank in the C tier, I can't lie. But regular oh no, this does get Toxic Spikes. Maybe we could put this in C actually, because the one weakness is pretty good, and Aftermath is a pretty useful ability. Having Toxic Spikes is actually pretty useful for Skuntank, I can't lie. And I didn't even realize it got those. That must be new. Raw Toxic and Toxic Spikes is actually a pretty decent niche. This is Foul Play and Haze, similar to Quillfish. Taunt is also pretty good, and it has a slightly worse speed tier of 84 instead of 85. Otherwise, it's pretty much just a slightly more offensive Quillfish, though, that also has stuff like Nasty Plot and Memento, which is useful for it. They're pretty interchangeable, in my opinion, at this point because of the Toxic Spikes, so we'll give it C tier. Spiritomb, this actually gets a C tier, and it's a pretty strong option. Currently, I'm actually going to put this at the top of C tier. Spiritomb has weirdly enough found itself as a semi-viable Trick Room setter in this current format. I think that realistically, among the dark typing, this is actually a fairly okay option. We've seen it on teams with stuff like Leftovers, Seeds, Roselli, Berry, Mental Herb, etc. Where you'll be running like a Snarl, Trick Room, Wisp, and then filler, whether it's Foul Play, Pain Split, Shadow Sneak, really whatever. Infiltrator is a pretty decent ability to get around just screens. You could pair this stuff with Pokemon like Iron Hands and other Trick Room abusers like Kingambit, and do a lot of damage to Pokemon in my opinion. I think it's a decent option, especially when the only weakness is Fairy, and we're currently not really seeing a lot of Terra Fairy options outside of really just Fluttermane, and Fluttermane's really the only viable Fairy right now anyway. So honestly, I gotta give it to Spiritomb. I think this is a pretty decent Pokemon currently in my opinion, and I'm gonna give it the C tier. Weavile gets the D tier. Honestly, it's just slightly better Sneasel. It's purely just slightly better in the speed and the offense aspect, but losing stuff like Axel and Knockoff really does hurt Weavile's viability a lot. And I don't think that either are that good right now. This is probably the worst format Weavile has had historically ever. Not to say it's a great VGC Pokemon to begin with, but the format just doesn't really need it. It doesn't need the 125 Fake Out because Covert Cloak exists. It doesn't really care about Icicle Crash because it doesn't do enough damage. Even with Terrestrial, Weavile is just kind of outclassed, and it's not really that good. If I want to use another Ice type, I'll use Terra. Or I'll use like Bundle, which is faster anyway, and again, can run Covert Cloak. It can run Protect even just to get around Fake Out. I can just go with Terra Ghost even, which is another thing that just gets around Fake Out and just really hurts these fast Fake Out users that are really frail, that rely on Focus Sash. They're just not that good right now. At least with Persian, for example, as a Fake Out user, it doesn't need Focus Sash because of Fur Coat and Assault Vest that's existing. Whereas Weavile just doesn't, it's not bulky even with those options. Even with AV, it's not bulky. Even if you throw a lot of bulk investment, it's just not that bulky. We're gonna give it D tier. Hisuian Samurott, honestly, this will be a B tier option for sure. Definitely bottom of B tier, but I think the sharpness will carry this thing out of irrelevancy. Samurott also just being a fairly decent offensive option with stuff like Cecil's Edge being a layer of spikes could be decent for breaking sashes late game. I can totally see this thing actually being on teams with like Talonflame, for example, and filling out a role on the Talon Tusk teams actually is a really good psychic killer. It would be amazing for Psy Spam actually, killing both Armouge and also Indeedee pretty easily. On top of also then breaking sashes for later team members. Overall, this will actually be an incredible Pokemon. I'm actually going to put it higher. I'm going to put this thing above Alolan Muck. This is a really strong Pokemon though, and I totally actually do see this thing having a place in the metagame. If Hisuian Samurott genuinely is an unviable Pokemon, I would actually be astounded, because I think that this will be just a slightly better version of Gallade just due to what it would actually be responsible for checking. And I say this knowing for the fact that despite having Roaring Moon and Kingambit currently in the format, Armouge is still one of the best Pokemon, and it's easily one of the best not Paradox spawns. To put in a perspective of how good this thing is, if we look starting at the console usage for just VGC Series 2, it is currently the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th most used Pokemon in the format, and if we only include non-Paradox, it is the 4th. If we go into Showdown usage, it goes to, I think it's like the 10th, 4th, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep, it's the 10th most used, and among non-Paradox, it is the 6th most used. If we go into tournament usage, Armrouge is the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, come on, 12th. It is the 12th most used, and among not Paradox Mons, it is the 7th most used. Which again, the fact that Armrouge is still sitting this high in a metagame with stuff like Fluttermane, Roaring Moon, both topping the charts, as well as stuff like King Gambit being amazing, Great Tusk being amazing, Iron Bundle being amazing. Like, a lot of these Pokemon should be beating Armrouge, and it's still just withstanding the metagame. So I think knowing that Samurai Hisuian form will be a great resistance to both Water and Psychic for this Mon will actually be a huge option in terms of countering this thing. So I think this is an easy objective B tier. Moving on, we have Crocodile. Crocodile gets the bottom of C tier, purely gets an Intimidate Dark Ground type, which is honestly pretty cool. It's immune to Prankster options you could maybe use as a good taunt user. Its Intimidate's pretty valuable. Ground typing is pretty good because there's not a lot of good ground types in this format. I think it's definitely a C tier, albeit I think the niche that stuff like Quillfish and Skuntank have as Toxic Spike users with Haze for Dentozo is pretty good. I think Sableye provides a lot more general team utility. I think a Spiritomb with Chirkrum is pretty good. I'm actually going to bump Sableye above Spiritomb, by the way. I think that Sableye screens is slightly more appreciated as well as Quash in this format, but they're both pretty interchangeable for what it's worth. Crook is definitely the objective war C tier. I can't really think of a C tier Mon that will actually enter here that's going to be better than, worse than Crook. Moving on to Zoroark. Zoroark's a D tier. I'm going to put it like right above Honchkrow at least, because realistically, I think that this has niche actually as an illusion Pokemon, but I still think this will definitely be a lot worse, especially with the nerfs that are coming, because apparently there were some bugs around Zoroark's illusion ability. So I guess the one reason you would have even used Zoroark is definitely going to be a bit lower for sure. Still definitely a fine enough option for what it's worth, just considering the fact that Zoroark in general has a good enough speed tier, its typing is okay, its coverage is fine enough, and it hits what it needs to, really, but it's just one of those mons you're really only running if you're trying to just say you're running Zoroark. That's about it. Definite D tier. Bisharp gets a D tier. This is better than Honchkrow, but really, Bisharp would actually be a fairly viable mon. It's just that King Gambit alone invalidates its existence entirely. Actually, I'm gonna put it at the bottom of C tier. This isn't to say that you should use Bisharp, but again, it would be this is more so to make up for the fact that if King Gambit didn't exist, this would probably be like a high B tier. And instead I was gonna put it in the D tier, so I'm gonna compromise and we're just gonna put it at the bottom of C. Kind of shitty reasoning, I know, but it's my tier list, so I'm doing that. You're welcome. Hydreigon actually gets a solid bottom of A tier. Hydreigon is still actually a fairly viable option with stuff like Terra Fairy, and Terra Fire, Poison, Steel being fairly viable Terra types in this. The Levitate helps a lot with the defensive typing, and I will say that someone did comment way back when I did my initial tiering before the before the decks even leaked. Not before the decks even leaked, before how Terra worked even leaked, of my predicted list off of the initial Scarlet and Violet BGC rankings, and I put this thing in like the very bottom tiers. And someone had mentioned that there's no way Hydreigon would be bad, no way Hydreigon would be bad in this sort of format. And I thought they were crazy at the time. And honestly, they're right. This thing is a fucking demon, and I will eat my words on that. I was objectively wrong. Hydreigon is filthy as shit. This thing is a great option. It innovated the focus energy meta as well for this year. Incredible Pokemon. Really, it's only down here because of how commonly used a lot of these S tiers are that just take its place in the meta. Stuff like Hydreigon, for example, definitely not Hydreigon. Stuff like, for example, Roaring Moon. Iron Jugulis gives competition because it does a similar enough role to the bulkier Hydreigons, at least, that we're running AV, which is another incredible set in this mon, by the way. Regardless, still a fairly decent option, though, and despite a lot of the high usage from these Paradox Darks, it's still definitely holding its own. Definite A tier for sure. Greninja's gonna be... Greninja's gonna get above Bisharp at least. Actually, it's also gonna get above... I'm gonna give it above Skuntank, below Quillfish. The fact this is a really fast Toxic Spike user is pretty cool. Greninja would actually be in the high B tier if it kept map block, because I think that Greninja would actually have a place in the metagame with it for helping stuff that is just a heavy setup sweeping options. Greninja, sadly though, losing that kind of hurts, but it still has a fast taunt and Toxic Spikes. It could essentially fill a Meowscarada role while having priority Water Shuriken, which is, while it's not as damaging as Sucker Punch, you could also at least get the more consistent priority option with this, which is good. Greninja got some decent move pool buffs as well with stuff like Liquidation, so it helps a lot on the physical side. But at the same time, I think Greninja just benefits more from being a special attacker anyway here. Protean nerf is huge. It's really bad for it, actually. And I think it hurts a lot of Greninja's niche. However, keeping your dark type is valuable, at least to avoid pranks or taunt or Thunder Wave, which could hurt Greninja in theory. Definitely not the best option, but I still think it's okay enough to where we'll give it the C tier. Definitely, though, this is not a great generation for Greninja. Hoopa Unbound gets a bottom of B tier. I think Hoopa will be a fine option if we do get another mythical format, for sure. Its bulk is actually fairly decent, and I think that Hoopa Unbound would have a place as a solid Assault Mon. One of the biggest, actually, you know what? I'm actually going to give Hoopa bottom of A tier. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I think Hoopa will be an amazing Terramon, actually. Realistically, I think that we'll actually see some defensive sets that are going to turn into like maybe Terra Ghost or some random Terra typing that would help with the bug weakness, while also just in general being good defensively speaking. And maybe like a Terra Fire set, for example, or like a Terra Fairy set where you just go for like a really defensive Hoopa and you just try and break teams, or maybe like a really good offensive bulky Hoopa and go for like a Trick Room team, or really whatever. But Hoopa has a lot of coverage. It has some really filthy offensive moves too, with stuff like Knockoff, Gunk Shot, Hyperspace Fury, which does Breakthrough Protect. You get stuff like, for example, a Nasty Plot, and also you get, you know, you don't get Sword Dance, unfortunate. You still get Nasty Plot to set up for the special sets as well, which is decent. This thing has two incredible offenses, and while I think it hurts a lot from open sheet just because Hoopa could have been a really good mixed mon and really just surprise a lot of teams with its movesets, Hoopa's still a fairly decent offensive piece, and with Terra, this should actually be really filthy to play against. Overall, I'm going to give this thing a solid A tier. I'm curious to see what Hoopa brings to the table if it is allowed at a future point, because I think it could actually be fairly interesting for the metagame. Grimmsnarl's up next. Grimmsnarl gets an S tier. This is an objectively amazing dark. It's going to be one of the best dark types in the format as a whole. Even if we were to allow like every single event Pokemon, like Arceus, for example, Grimm would still be one of the best. Great screen support. Sucker Punch is priority. Thunder Wave is priority for support. You get Parting Shot. You have stuff like Spirit Break to drop special attackers, Foul Play to take advantage of physical ones. Really, Grimm is just the new Incineroar. It's the new Incineroar, but slightly worse than what Incineroar was in Generation 8. And I'm kind of shocked that Grimm isn't seeing like 20-25% usage, because personally I think it's actually a fucking amazing Pokemon. For what it's worth, it's still seeing about 10%, which is pretty decent, especially when you consider the fact that we still have mons like Murkrow running around the tier and at least competing for that dark type prankster role. And also you're seeing a lot of shift away from prankster just solely for the fact that so much priority blocking is out right now with stuff like Furgraph to at least stop incoming team priority, less so the screen stuff, for example. We're seeing stuff like just a lot of dark types in the tier, which get around Parting Shot, as well as Clear Amulet, which just stops Parting Shot from even allowing the switch to begin with. So I think that a lot is going against what Grimm could be doing right now. If this was, to put it in perspective, I think if Grimm had this moveset in Generation 8, I think Grimm would be like a top 5 Pokemon, which it was already like a top 10 mon for what it's worth, but it would definitely be like a top 5, maybe even top 3. Right now, it's still a solid mon. I think it's still incredibly difficult to take out, but Grimm is still just sadly, this is a bad meta for Grimm. Great Pokemon though. Easy S tier. Urshifu. Urshifu gets the top of S. I'm gonna put it right below Arceus, but it's not really comparable just because of what Arceus is. It's just a gross Pokemon. But Urshifu is, objectively speaking, the best dark type that we're going to have on this list today. Having the ability to break through Protect is an insane thing in VGC. It's actually such a broken thing. On top of the fact that you also have a stab option that's going to shatter through even setup mons with a guaranteed crit rate. It's essentially Flower Trick, but it has, I think this is a slightly better damage output than Flower Trick. No, it has the same damage output as Flower Trick, actually, because they nerfed it. It should be 70 base. 75. Okay, so it's like 5 base higher, but it's still essentially like the same sort of thing. On top of that as well, despite having only 97 speed, this is an incredible Trick Room mon, and it's a lot more offensively potent than Meowscarada would be. As Meowscarada, I think it only has like in the 110, yeah, 110 attack, whereas Urshifu is 130. This thing also has stab priority with Sucker Punch, which is great. It has stuff like Close Combat. You can get some good setup. This will easily be an amazing Terra option with Steel and Poison being great for Fairies, which is really like the one typing you're actually using to check this mon. Overall, easy S tier, probably the best non-Arceus S tier that we have. Up next, we have Zarude. Zarude is a pretty good option. Definitely gonna get like the top of B. Zarude will benefit a lot from Terra. Realistically, though, one of the worst things that Zarude has going out of its favor is the typing. You do kind of need to Terra this thing, and the ability of being Leaf Guard isn't exactly the best for it. However, when you get stuff like Swords Dance and Trailblaze in your moveset, as well as moves like, well, this thing did lose Darkest Lariat, but it's not a huge deal because in VGC, realistically, does this thing get Throat Chop? If it gets Throat Chop, no, it doesn't get Throat Chop, but you still get Crunch, which is decent. Lariat could have actually been huge. This could have been a fucking, like, standout Dozo counter, and if it kept Lariat, I would have put it in, like, the high A tier, for what it's worth, because that could have actually been a strong niche. But this is still decent nonetheless. You could still go for stuff like Taunt. You have Taunt Sword Dance, which is great for stall breaking most teams. You get some cool support like Encore. Jungle Healing is amazing, especially in doubles. Realistically, this is a fine enough option. I do think that, sadly, Zarude missing Lariat is really bad for it, though. So we're going to give it just the B tier, and we'll leave it at that. Overquill. Overquill, we're going to put right behind Greninja. I think Overquill will be slightly worse than Greninja. Not Greninja, Qwilfish. But it's still going to be a viable enough Intimidate mon. Between Intimidate and Toxic Spikes, again, this will just do the same sort of role, but slightly better offensively than as Qwilfish would do. The difference being is I think that Qwilfish having to only rely on a Violate is slightly more useful to the metagame than Overquill, which will steal a typically useful item unless you're going to go for a Black Sludge set. But for example, if you're using something like a Rocky Helmet, you'd probably be running that on other Pokemon. In fact, even Black Sludge, you'd probably run on other Pokemon. Stuff like, for example, Focus Sash, fairly useful item. Something like a Life Orb, fairly useful item. You get the picture. Overquill will just be competing for item slot. Qwilfish never really will have to, and that's really a deciding factor there. Meowscarada gets the high A tier. We're going to put this thing right behind Tyranitar. Flower Trick is really useful. This is just a slightly more passive version of Urshifu, but it can't break through Protect. However, the typing is really good with the Dark and Grass typing, getting not only around the Prankster Darks, but it also gets around stuff like Spore and Rage Powder, which is pretty cool. Overall, it's a pretty decent option for what it's worth. Meowscarada definitely is still fairly offensively potent, and I think that realistically, Meowscarada is here to stay. I thought it would definitely fall off a bit with the Paradox Mons. I will say it definitely has, but it's doing better than I thought it would be for what it's worth, considering the fact that Meowscarada is still sitting at, I want to say like 7% usage. It's actually at like 9% usage. Holy shit. I didn't think it was that high, I can't lie, but honestly, really good Pokemon nonetheless. Realistically, I do think that Meowscarada will just have a place in the metagame for a while, but I don't know exactly in what degree it will. I do expect that Meowscarada will overall just always be a good mon for what it's worth, but I think it's going to definitely go down in usage as we add more Pokemon, stuff like the Paradoxes, because Chien-Pao will take a lot of competition for that fast Dark typing, where she will take a lot of competition for the just general defensiveness. Wo-Chien will be a great sponge for it, especially with Terra. Ting-Lu will also be a great sponge for this, especially with Terra. And I think realistically, just the Paradox Mons, not the Paradox, the Ruin Pokemon will add a lot of competition as far as that Dark typing goes, though stacking Darks has never been an issue in this generation for VGC. We're typically already seeing multiple on teams. I think as well, though, with the rise of a lot of the home Pokemon coming, stuff like Galar Moltres, Urshifu, etc., we're going to see a lot of Meowscarada falling off. The one benefit is that their stabs do hurt pre-Terra Dondozo pretty well, but that's really where it ends. Overall, still a great option. I think that Tyranitar is... Actually, I'm going to put it right above Tyranitar. I think it's slightly better than T-Tar for sure. Definitely, though, high A tier. Lokix, this gets right above Honchkrow in the B tier, in the D tier. I said this in the bug type tiering, and I'll say it again. I think that this is comparable to Spupa viability, which says a lot. A lot of these Pokemon, I think, are, again, on that Spupa level of viability, where Spupa has, like, a definitive role that it does for teams. These all have, like, one role they do for teams. Sneasel and Weavile are fake-out users that activate Coal. Zoroark is here to try and bluff other better Pokemon, which you could just bring those other better Pokemon as well. To begin with, Lokix is here to try and break Psychics when a lot of the Psychics just get immune to priority anyway. Stuff like Frigg has the immunity naturally through ability. Indeedee has it through Psychic Terrain. Armreach has it through being next to Indeedee for Psychic Terrain. You don't really get a lot of usage from Lokix in this format, in my opinion. The difference with Honchkrow is that it has Moxie. Lokix has Tinted Lens, which is cool, but it's too frail to make it work. Honchkrow is slightly bulky, which is kind of cool for it. Lokix isn't. But at the same time, though, the speed is a lot better with 92 being pretty cool. Overall, it's still a D tier, really kind of shit. Bombardier gets a D tier as well. I'm putting it right above Lokix. Not a great Pokemon, but it has a really fucking broken ability, which is solely the reason that it gets this spot. For what it's worth, stuff like Brave Bird, Rock Slide, Parting Shot knockoff, etc. could be all decent options. You could run this thing with like a Focus Sash set. You could run it with maybe like a Citrus Berry and try and make it bulky, but it's not really that bulky. Maybe AV could be decent as well. So for what it's worth, this thing does get a lot of cool moves. You could run like Drill Run, Brave Bird, Rock Slide, and then knockoff, and then try and make that work on a set, or even throw U-turn on there. And again, just try and make AV work for you. But overall, just kind of shit. Definite D tier for sure. Mabosstiff also gets the D-tiering. We're going to put it like right above Lokix as well, solely for the ability set. Mabosstiff having a lot of options, of course, that benefit it. Stuff like Intimidate, Guard Dog, Stakeout, all being great abilities, but overall just an underwhelming Pokemon for sure. Coverage set is great, but it's just, again, the stats aren't really doing it any favors. 85 speed is whatever. Bulk is kind of average. It doesn't really offer a unique role for the metagame either to have these sort of stats. Like, for example, Samurott, it has fairly comparable bulk. For example, they both have Samurott is like 10 more HP. Mabosstiff is 10 more Phys Def. They both have pretty near similar SpDef, with Mabosstiff having 5 higher. Mabosstiff is slightly more offensive. They have the same speed tier. Samurott has a lot better special attack. The difference being that Samurott is dual typed, and that helps a lot better against stuff like Armourouge. It carves out a unique niche for it. Mabosstiff would need to force a Terra to do that, and even still, it's only checking one of the stabs, not both. So Samurott would objectively just have more viability in that. Also, Samurott having a stronger, more consistent option to boost its offenses is pretty cool, considering the fact that Guard Dog is really only good against Intimidators. Stakeout is only good if they switch, which is just, Samurott's always boosting their damage. So I'm going to give it to Mabosstiff D tier, but not great. Brute Bonnet's amazing. Fucking great Pokemon. This definitely gets an A tier. Great Dondozo counter with loaded dice. Really good just overall sponge. Great Mon with redirection with stuff like Rage Powder. You get Spore as well. It's slightly outclassed by Amoonguss, but it's still actually a fairly decent Pokemon. Definite A tier. Roaring Moon gets a bottom S tier, and this will be the bottom S tier actually on the list. I think Roaring Moon is actually fairly underwhelming for what it's worth, but it's only really underwhelming compared to how much it's being used, considering this is still a top 10 used Mon across no matter which format you're playing. The lowest that I've actually found through usage is the fact that Roaring Moon in the specifically, if we're going through the tournament usage, not the tournament usage, the showdown usage, is sitting at 9th out of the top 10 Mons. The rest have it in like the top 5, which is fucking insane, because I think that Roaring Moon is actually fairly easy to beat. Whether it's stuff like Iron Bundle, Fluttermane, Iron Hands, they all check it pretty easily. Stuff like Great Tusk can be EV to handle this thing. Even the Terra Flying Acro sets can be handled by Great Tusk. Pre-Terra, keep in mind. Like, I don't think it's actually that hard to beat Roaring Moon for what it's worth. And I do think that there are a lot of Mons that get a lot less usage that are better than it. Bonnet's not one of them, but Bonnet is still pretty good for what it's worth. In fact, I'm actually going to put Bonnet above T-Tar and Meowscarada. I do think that Bonnet is pretty decent, but it's like literally the definitive best A tier. I think that there's better stuff both in the pool of Mons that are to come in the future seasons, as well as the Mons that haven't that are currently in the format and that get lower usage than it, but I'll get into those in a moment. Like, I think Grim is better than it, for example. I think Grim's a lot more consistent than it. We have another couple dark types as well that I think are definitively better than it, but overall, still fine enough. It's still a really strong option. I just think that for a Mon that is getting usage like this thing, like it's getting about 20% usage, to put in perspective. Like, this is fucking insane. In fact, in tournaments, it's getting about 28% usage, which again, fucking insane, because I don't think it's good enough for 28% usage. It's still an S tier though. Jugulus gets the high B tier. I'm going to put this thing right above Persian. I'm actually also going to put Samurott above Persian because of the fake out stuff I was mentioning for Sneasel Weavile. But Jugulus is pretty decent. It's a cool booster energy Mon actually, and it's a lot better than I thought it would be for what it's worth. Initially, I thought that Jugulus was just going to be a worse Hydreigon. Well, actually, that's a lie. Pre-format, I thought this would be a better Hydreigon, but still not great. When Series 1 came out, I thought it was just be an objectively worse Hydreigon. Now I think it's only a slightly worse Hydreigon. The flying type is actually fairly useful for Mons like Amoonguss, for example. The natural stab is pretty decent. Dark flying as a typing is pretty good. Overall, Quark Drive is also a really good ability, trying to boost the speed with booster energy. This is an incredible candidate for it. And having the natural flying typing versus having to Terra into a third type to get it is one benefit it has over Roaring Moon. However, at the same time, I think that they've really, unless you're running Jugulus and Rain, there's usually a better Pokemon that you can run over it. Jugulus and Rain is pretty good though, actually. You can get Hurricane and Hydro Pump with also Dark Pulse. Like, this can actually be a terrifying Rainmon. But I still think it's not bad in certain archetypes. Like, it's a cool option. I've read it on fucking the Hydreigon, Iron Hands, Hariyama, Mischievous Slaughtermane team, and it was actually pretty terrifying in that. But overall, I mean, I think this is a fine Pokemon. Jugulus definitely has a place in the metagame, a lot more than I think a lot of people gave it credit for, but it's still just a whatever option. Ting-Lu. Ting-Lu is one of the best dark types in this generation. It's one of the best new dark types for VGC. Incredible defenses. This thing is incredible check to Chiyu. Ting-Lu, I think, of the Ruin Mons, will be the best. However, I think they're all going to be S tiers in their own right. Ting-Lu, though, being able to drop a lot of the physical offense will be valuable in this format as fuck. Well, actually, no, Wo-Chien drops physical offense. I mean, this still drops special defense, which is incredible. To put in perspective, you can go, like, get a 4 KO'd or 5 KO by Chiyu with this thing, which is insanity. This thing has incredible Terra types into stuff like Poison, for example, which help a lot with defensive matchups against Fighting and Fairy. You can go for stuff like Grass, which could be valuable just as a good defensive type, or Fire or Water. Like, you could really just make any defensive Terra on this Pokemon work, essentially, and Ting-Lu will fill the role. It's a decent check to size spam between the natural ability to pressure Armarouge and Indeedee with the Dark typing, but also the fact that you get a strong Earthquake out of it. Ruination is an amazing move, as you can use this to try and break Dondozo significantly easier, which is another reason to try and run Grass or Water as a typing if you're using this as a Dozo check. Then you could also go with Fairy to just stop Order Up to begin with, which could be decent to stop it from stat boosting. Overall, incredible Pokemon. Easily one of the best new Mons in this generation for VGC. Easy S tier. Chien-Pao. Weirdly enough, I thought this thing would be the strongest Ruin Pokemon going into the generation, and I actually think it's only the third strongest. I think the only thing that is worse than it of the Ruins would be Wo-Chien. I'm going to put this thing right above Grim. This is still a fairly strong offensive option, actually, and it's an incredibly potent Mon for sure. The 135 speed is nothing to be trifled with. I just think that if I'm running in a fast Ice type, I'm going to run Bundle because it's 1 point faster and gets off the Ice or slightly faster. Whereas otherwise, I need to risk tying with Flutter Mane, and that's actually a pretty big deal. The difference between guarantee outpacing Flutter Mane and then KOing it with your partner Pokemon versus tying with Flutter Mane and having to run not only a mix set, which this thing does have a bit of 4 attacks on Form Musala Syndrome between Sucker Punch, Throat Chop, Icicle Crash, Sacred Sword, Icy Wind, Protect, Sword Dance. Look, this has a bit of 4 Musala Syndrome. That doesn't even get into if you're running Terra Blast with a Terra type. I think this thing is a monster in singles. In doubles, though, it's just an S tier, and it's a fine S tier. Wo-Chien is definitely going to be an S tier as well. I think Wo-Chien definitely is a bit slept on for what it's worth. This is still an incredible Pokemon. Being able to drop the physical offense is nothing to sleep on. This thing is amazing. I've actually ran this thing in Battle Spot, not Battle Spot doubles, in Smogon doubles, the 6v6 format. Just trying to test some teams before even the Series 1 ladder opened up, before everyone thought the Paradox Mons were going to be banned. And honestly, Wo-Chien's fucking sick. This thing has been really impressive on Parashop teams, and I think it will have a place on those for what it's worth. Between Leech Seed and also stuff like Foul Play, you get stuff like Snarl. Like, this thing is a fairly obnoxious Pokemon to KO, actually. Between the ability that drops the attack of all Pokemon by 25%, as well as Snarl dropping a potent special attack, you can make this thing into a pretty unkillable fucking Pokemon. Easy S tier in my opinion. The typing as well has the same benefit of Bonnet and Masquerada being immune to not only prankster stuff, which is great for getting around a lot of common taunters, but it's also really good at getting around stuff like Spore and Rage Powder, so you can guarantee those leeches off. Easy S tier. Chiyu, easy S tier. This is an incredible Pokemon. Realistically, this is going to be one of the best Tailwind options once it's in the format. You're going to throw this thing on Sun teams with stuff like Flutter Mane, Chiyu, and then maybe like a Tailwind Pokemon like Talonflame or Murkrow, and you're just going to start decimating everything. Like, this thing will essentially melt through teams like fucking paper. It's going to be really easy to just start blowing through teams with the special offense, and it's going to be why Ting-Lu is going to be so viable, is to check Chiyu, essentially. So it's going to be an easy S tier for sure. Really good Sun Pokemon. This will make Sun a truly viable Pokemon in the format. Well, a truly viable playstyle, I should say. Finally, Kingambit. Now, I actually do think that Kingambit is an S tier. This will go right above Grimmsnarl. For what it's worth, this is one of those dark types that I think is just better than Roaring Moon despite usage, and I think that soon we're going to actually see an uptick in Kingambit to where it's being used more than Roaring Moon. This is one of the best size spam checks, it's one of the best trigger checks, it's one of the best ways to pressure Intimidators like Arcanine, for example, despite the fact that it can burn you. You could always go for stuff like a Terra Fire, Lumberry sets, etc., and put that pressure back on Arcanine. Kingambit also can use Terra Flying to get around weaknesses to Pokemon like Great Tusk, and you can Terra Blast and KO it right back. Kingambit, in my opinion, is easily one of the most underrated Pokemon in the format, which feels weird to say because it's in the top 20 most used, but I feel like Kingambit's like easily a top 10 Pokemon, maybe even a top 5 Mon right now. Realistically, this is a Pokemon that I think could fit on a lot of different teams with extreme ease, And in my opinion, of the Pokemon that are currently legal in VGC, this is actually the best Dark type you should be running on teams. But let me know what you guys think down below. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like this, like and subscribe. Going into next week's tier list, if you guys are curious what type we're going to be covering next, we're going to continue the alphabetical order and go into Dragon types. So if you're looking forward to the Dragon type tier list, make sure you subscribe for that. With that said, shoutouts to channel members, of course, being Josh K, Ultra Player, Mia, Zeke Zero, Matt O'Shea, Koemi, and Slade. If you guys want to become channel members today, it's only a couple dollars a month, and you get bonus content such as our ladder challenges that are going to be going up later today, actually, which we're going to be, I don't know what it's going to be yet. Well, no, it's not going to be later today. It's going to be next week on Saturday, I should say, which we're currently polling that right now for channel members. So if you want to join, you can get in on that vote still. And with that said, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Until then, peace out, guys.